Okay, so now I'll switch back and forth here between these different ones here. Okay, so then um, okay, so we'll go over the legislative districts first, and then I'll show you all the map here. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about legislative districts and why they're important to a discussion of a legislature. Because when you have a legislature, which of course, as we've discussed already, is a large body of elected officials that represent people, across a region. And of course, what we're looking at here is a state legislature. So we have a group of individuals who have been elected, and they are representing people across the state of Texas, right? So when we look at legislative districts in terms of its importance, obviously, of course, when you have a legislature, you need to be able to elect people from all the areas of the region that you're representing. So that's what we see here within all types of legislatures, whether it's Congress, whether it's here within the state legislature here in Texas. So let's talk a little bit about how this process works in terms of where do the districts come from, how are the districts drawn up, and we talked a little bit about that in terms of apportionment and redistricting. We talked a little bit about that in back last week when we started this chapter. But let's go more into detail. Okay, so legislative districts. So originally, of course, when we had the districts, first off, the book talks about how we used to have what was called unequally populated districts, where back before the 1960s, we had districts where you would have like much more people in one district than another, or you would also have like some of these rural districts where they didn't have that many people, but you had legislators that were representing rural areas, so they didn't have as many people that they needed to represent. And then you kind of just crammed in people over there in the cities, and they had less representation because they had maybe like one rep for that large population. But as you can see here, that's not really fair, because if, let's say, you've got some legislator out in the countryside that maybe is only responsible for a couple thousand people, and then you have a legislator in the city that's responsible for like 500,000 people, you can see already that that's not really all that fair, right? So what we see here is we saw that there were some Supreme Court cases such as Baker v. Carr, which kind of put a stop to that, to where now they use the one person, one vote rule, where now the districts have to be pretty much equal in terms of population. So for a state house seat, it's about 173,000. For a state Senate seat, it's about 840,000. So what that means, and I'm going to show you all the maps here so y'all can see that the way that the maps are drawn up is based on population, right? So each district appointed one senator, one representative, despite vastly unequal sizes, right? So this is the way, in terms of it used to be. But now with Baker v. Carr, of course, now we have this set up to where now the districts have to be the same when it comes to population, relatively the same. Now, when I show you all the map, though, you're going to see why this can be a problem. Now, of course, we also have, in terms of the way the redistricting happens here, let's kind of backtrack a little bit, that we have redistricting and reapportionment. This usually happens, sorry, I guess somebody sent me an email, but anyway, that's fine. This happens after we have the census. Now, you all remember a couple years ago, we had the 2020 census, right? Every 10 years, the United States is responsible for conducting a census, right? To conducting a count of people living within their country, and not just within the country, but where in the country, right? And of course, this makes sense because population is constantly changing, right? We've got new babies being born, people pass away, people move to different locations. So population is constantly changing, right? New immigrants coming over and becoming citizens, people maybe leaving the country. So population shifts are always going to be happening, and also from different states to the other, right? Some states gain population, some states lose population. So that's the whole reason as to why we need to have redistricting, because with population changes also comes changes in representation, because as more areas gain more population, there's going to be a need for more government representation, right? So a good example is Texas, right? Texas in the last several years has gained in population, and so they've picked up some seats in Congress, right? In terms of the House. Remember that with the House, that's based on population of the state. So we've seen more members of Congress coming from Texas because Texas has gained in population at the expense of some other states. Like I know in New York, they lost a House seat because they were losing population. So when it comes to the state, the way the state does this is the state legislature is the entity that's responsible for redrawing those lines based on population changes. If the legislature itself isn't able to, if they're not able to complete this process, then it goes to the legislative redistricting board, which are 5 ex officio state officials. Ex officio means that you have the ability to serve on this board because of your current position, right? So not, this isn't something that can be elected outside of, the legislature or the state executive. The people that serve in, on this board, it's a special board that is reserved, solely for those top players within Texas government, right? And so they're responsible for the finished redistricting process if the legislature cannot, right? So it goes to the legislature first. If they can't agree on it, then it goes to the legislative redistricting board, which is comprised of the lieutenant governor, the speaker of the House, the comptroller of public accounts, the general land commissioner, and the attorney general, right? So these are the top major players in state government, right? So they're the ones who will ultimately end up drawing the lines, right? Because because that's also backtrack. So reapportionment is looking at the numbers, looking at the population numbers, and then determining, how many districts you're going to have, and then redistricting is actually drawing the lines. So let me now show you all the the map really quickly. Okay, so this is okay. Let me see. Okay, well, let's go to the House one, right? So let's show you all this here, right? So let me go ahead and scroll over here really quick. Let me scroll further, closer. Now this is the map for the Texas House districts. Okay, now there are 150 House districts in Texas. Now remember that each one of these pockets is about 173,000 people, give or take. So do you see that in some parts of the state that these districts are a lot smaller than others in terms of size? But the reason why they're so small is because these are your major population areas. This is the DFW Metroplex, right? So this, of course, is, you've got Dallas County, Tarrant County, Denton, Collin County. So these are the 4 major counties within the Metroplex area, right? So it makes sense that you would see a bunch of state reps here, right? Because again, there's millions of people that live here, right? So each one of these districts is 173,000, right? The other, the next largest populated area is the Houston metro area. So this is where you have Harris County as well as Montgomery County. Fort Bend also is, pretty populated. So you can see that there's a lot of state House seats in the Houston area. The 3rd largest populated area is the I-35 corridor between San Antonio and Austin, right? So you can see San Antonio's got several House seats as well, going up here to Travis County and, the counties in between, Williamson, so again, we see that this is the 3rd largest, and then the 4th is down here in the Valley. So we've got, several of these House seats as well here located within the Valley. So the major population areas, of course, are going to have more of these state House positions. And then going out further west, if you go up here to the Panhandle and even over here in far west Texas, these districts can be massive because no one really lives out here, right? Earlier this summer, I actually drove to Amarillo for the first time and actually drove through this area. I would say it's pretty, even down from Abilene, because I went from Abilene all the way down to San Antonio. So not so many people live out here, right? So you can see that these districts are rather large because all of these districts are 173,000 people. Now, if we go over to the Senate seats or the Senate map here, similar situation, where if we scroll further into DFW, you see that there are still several Senate seats because these are almost 1 million people, 840,000. Not as many because obviously, of course, the districts you need more people to house these districts. So, we're down to 31 because again, it's more people. Same thing with Houston and the San Antonio, Austin area, and even in the Valley, right? We've got 3 state senators that are, that comprise portions of the Valley here. But as you can see, these territories are a lot bigger, right? Because this is 840,000 people. This is 840. That's why I wouldn't want to be one of these state senators out here because they gotta traverse through a large area, if they want, if they want to, obviously, of course, if they want to do this job, well, right, they definitely want to try to move throughout the district and try to meet with their, try to meet with their constituents out in the districts and things like that. So, but again, the way these lines are drawn is based on population, right? Because all of these districts have to be, pretty much equal in population. Now, how these lines are drawn, that's where we get into the gerrymandering issue. Gerrymandering, of course, is the drawing of district lines in such a way as to give one faction or one party an advantage. Now, we could go on and on about gerrymandering. There's a lot of good resources and videos and articles that discuss this, in great detail. So what we're going to talk about here is, because I mentioned it's an ongoing political battle in Texas. There have been several times where, this whole idea of redistricting has, proved problematic, politically problematic, such as examples, a couple of years ago where you had the federal government, the federal court system step in and basically invalidate, these districts, saying that, they disproportionately were affecting minorities and things like that. We've also had situations like the book talks about in 2003, where the Republicans, after they had gained control of the House for the first time in many decades, they decided to engage in this redistricting process. Now, I mentioned before that this always has to happen. Well, what I mean is that after a census, you always have to have redistricting. But this doesn't mean that redistricting only happens after a census. So what happened was that the Republican majority decided to do redistricting in a non-census year. And so the Democrats, of course, they made a big issue about it because they were making the argument that this was clearly done for political reasons. So some of the Democrats left to New Mexico, to Oklahoma, so that they wouldn't meet quorum. But we also saw something similar in 2021, 2 years ago, where Governor Abbott was trying to call some special sessions, and the Democrats had fled to Washington so that they couldn't meet quorum for the special session. So this is not something new that the Democrats that have been in the minority party for the last couple of decades, they've tried this tactic to try to not allow for quorum to happen so that Republicans are not able to get this done. But ultimately, they can't hold up the process forever. So ultimately, it does get done eventually, even if it takes a little bit more time, because the governor can call consecutive special sessions and things like that. And the governor also was, he was also going after, the funding for the legislators in terms of their paychecks and the staffers and all that stuff. So ultimately, that pressure allowed for the Democrats to ultimately go back and get in and work on what the governor was, because also keep in mind that was also a redistricting issue, right? Because 2021 was right after the census, right after the 2020 census, because after the census information gets, tabulated and officially certified, then it goes to the states. And so the redistricting will happen, in the year after the census happens, right? So, because it can't happen the year while it's going on, because they still need to get the numbers. But yeah, but the point in terms of gerrymandering is that if the lines are drawn in a way to where, if let's say you have a Republican majority and they draw the lines in a way to where, let's say you're in a district where, or let's say you're in an area where it's kind of like evenly split amongst Republicans and Democrats. So I'll give you an example here. Let's go back to like Harris County, right? So let me see if I can show you all the map here. Hold on, let me see if I can show you all the map. I want to show you all like how this can be written. So let me show. I think this would be a good idea of this would be a good idea here. So okay, hold on. Okay, let me show this to y'all again. So that way y'all can get a little bit of a visual here in terms of what it looks like. Okay, now, so some of these districts, in terms of the way they're drawn up, notice how some of these districts are kind of drawn like along the outskirts, kind of like, skirting around the city type of thing, kind of getting some rural areas as well as, but not necessarily going too far in the middle type of thing. You see this also with Harris County and some of these districts. They do this on purpose, where they're trying to not get too much of the inner city, especially if you're a Republican, because the inner city tends to be comprised of, more Democrat voters, right? So if you are a Republican, you want to try to draw your district in a way to where it's more so along the suburbs, right? Where you're going to have more of these conservative voters. So like for Creighton's, the Senate seat over here, right? Skirts along Harris County, goes north into Montgomery County, which is a very conservative area. This, of course, is you have the Woodlands, Conroe. Over here in northeastern Harris County, this is where you get to like the Kingwood area. And of course, obviously moving into Chambers County, also more conservative. So the way these districts are drawn, they're drawn this way for a reason, right? They're drawn in a way to where you want to try to have a setup to where you're going to have more voters that are more friendly to your cause, right? Some people have called it, it's not voters picking their politicians, it's politicians picking their voters, right? So there is a negative connotation with this whole idea of gerrymandering, and it's named after Elbert Jerry. Again, there's some videos that talk about this where he drew this district and it looked like a salamander. So the point of all this, of course, is that you have a situation where, because these are elected officials, they're going to be, drawing up their lines in a way that's going to benefit them, because the system allows for these elected officials to do that. And so that's why there tends to be, some backlash on this, because some people might feel that it's a conflict of interest. So again, this is just a brief overview of what gerrymandering is. And this is, both Democrats and Republicans are guilty of doing this. Even like in Democrat-dominated states, they also draw lines to keep their majority, which, it makes sense as to why they would do it, right? They would be stupid not to, try to keep their political power. So they draw the lines in a way to where they keep that power going. Now, again, like I said, people tend to not like this because it's kind of gaming the system and things like that. So that's why there is a lot of, backlash, against, this whole idea of gerrymandering. But if a political party is in the majority, you're going to expect them to try to keep that majority. So again, we can talk more about this, but let's go ahead and move on really quickly here. So okay, so again, these are some of the numbers here in terms of how the Democrats, which had a large majority back in the 70s, but they've now flipped, right? So this, of course, was during the political realignment phase, during the 1960s, during the American Civil Rights Movement, how a lot of former conservative Democrats who were part of the former FDR coalition back in the 1930s during the Great Depression, because back then the economy was the major issue and social issues kind of took a backseat. This is where you had like, social Northeast liberals in the same political party as some of these, Southern white supremacist type of things, no way that they would be in the same party today, because now the social issues have taken control. But back then it was the economic issues, because that was what was more pressing, right? It's like people were too poor. They didn't have time to worry about social issues and things like that. But now, now social issues have become at the forefront of what we think of when we think of these party disagreements, right? So we see this transition, right, where, the Democrats are really starting to lose seats, as these former conservative Democrats shift over to the Republicans. And then ultimately, like we said, 2003 was when we finally had the Republicans take control, and now it's kind of been a little bit of ebb and flow here. But for the most part, the Republicans have been, they've pretty much in the majority since 2003 here, and it's kind of stayed, kind of stagnant here in terms of the Democrats. The Republicans not having a super majority, but still a majority nonetheless here. Okay, so let's go and move on here. Okay, let's get to compensation here. So this is something you probably might not have known about our state legislature and our state, our members of the legislature here, is that they don't get paid that much. Compensation, one of the lowest state salaries, but highest per diems. Okay, so take a look at these numbers. This is not per month. Okay, it's 7,200. It's not per month. It's per year. Just to kind of, as I mentioned before, just to kind of mention, I made more than this in a month, in terms of, the money that these, these representatives are paid here. Now they do get a generous per diem, though. Per diem, of course, it's French for per day, so it's basically a daily allowance, right? You get $190, for every day that you are in session. So if you add that, the book talks about how, you can add that to about like the low to mid 30s, and in a year that you're actually meeting in session. Now that's pretty much on par with what your entry level state employees make. Like if you want to go work for like the Texas Health and Human Services Commission to be like one of those like benefits counselors, advisors, something like that, or my former job as a correctional officer with the Texas Juvenile Justice Department, they paid about in the lower 30s in terms of thousands, right? So that's pretty similar to what a state legislator would make with the per diem added. But as you can see here, this is something that people have made an issue of, right? And of course, they also get generous fringe benefits. They get an office allowance as well. They're able to hire staff, but the staff don't make that much money. One of my good friends actually works for one of the state representatives out in the Laredo area, and she makes peanuts. Like, and it's a part-time job, so she doesn't even make that much. Her job is extremely important, though. It's extremely important. Basically being a secretary to a state rep is a very important job. It comes with a lot of importance, a lot of responsibility, but she's not getting paid for that responsibility. I mean, you could make more money like delivering pizzas. It's just kind of something interesting to think about. And so this makes legislators very susceptible to lobbying tactics, where where the lobbyists, because they've got a lot more money, and they definitely have. We'll talk more about the lobbying that goes on in the interest groups chapter. But the book does talk about how that the lobbyists definitely can, they can definitely gain some power and influence, not just when it comes to the legislation that the lobbyists can get involved in, but also maybe giving them a job, right? There's a good video in the resources that talks about Jack Abramoff. He was one of these lobbyists. I know that's more for the national government, but basically he was able to convince some of these members of Congress as well as their staffers, because the staffers were probably even more susceptible, because like I mentioned, they don't make that much money at all, but they have a very important job. So the lobbyists could try to entice the staffers to go and work for them and make a lot more money. So I mean, it's definitely not unheard of to, it's definitely not something that could be inconceivable, right? So, but with this being said, of course, because the discussion question asks, what are the pros and cons of such salary, right? Do you think the salary should be raised? So I do want to mention that, the rationale for these low salaries, of course, it's almost like this is, coming out of, the 1870s, right? With the Texas Constitution and how it was set up, right? It's almost like they haven't kept up with inflation, right? They haven't raised the salary. So I guess 7,200 per year would be good in the 1870s, but not in the 2020s, right? So, but again, there's reasons for this, right? We talked about how that Texas wants to keep with this idea of limited government. It goes back to the whole biennial session, right? We only meet once every 2 years, but some people will make an argument that made sense for a more rural state that wasn't very populated, because remember, back in the 1800s, Texas was very sparsely populated, but Texas is now the second most populated state in the country. So some people might feel that it just doesn't make a lot of logical sense to only meet once every 2 years for a couple of months to get business done for a state of only 30 million people. Same thing with the money, right? Some people would make an argument that who's going to want to do this job for such a paltry salary? So what also ends up happening, and the book doesn't really mention this, but this is something that I've observed, not just with my studying of this, but also with some of my friends who are state reps as well, is that what this also does is that this creates a situation where the average Texan cannot go serve in the legislature because they have their own job to, their own profession that they have to maintain, right? Jobs are not going to let people take a break from their work to go serve in the legislature for a couple of months. I mean, I wish they would. I know if I was running a business and if one of my employees got elected to the state legislature, yeah, absolutely go. That's going to make us look good as a business. That's going to put us on the map. But not everyone has the foresight to see it that way, right? Because they've got their own responsibilities that they need them there. So what ends up happening is that the type of people who tend to serve in the legislature are people that either run their own business where they don't have a boss that they have to answer to. They don't have to show up because they run the business. So it caters more to business owners. as well as attorneys who can also kind of set their own schedule, right? They can decide, you know what, I'm not going to take cases for the next couple of months because I'm going to be serving the legislature. But the average person can't do that, right? The average person can't go and tell their job, you know what, like I'm going to leave for a few months. So, I'll see you in the summer. Oh, I might even need the summer because what if we get called in a special session? Like actually the special session, there is a special session that just was called recently and they're starting this week here. So yeah, I mean, you have to have your schedule open to be able to go do these things, but who's going to keep their schedule open for this amount of money? It's just something to think about, right? In terms of, so that's why when you see the type of people who serve in the legislature, they pretty much already have to have money on their own. This is kind of just like gravy, right? This, I guess you could say that's kind of like they could use it as like their lodging money or things like that, So especially because Austin is so expensive. That's another thing also that the book doesn't really mention is that Austin has just become so expensive in recent years that, good luck trying to find a place there that's affordable. And you're probably not gonna be able to get a lease for half a year, right? You might, but leases might not necessarily work that way. I know I've thought of this before myself, because I've thought of maybe doing this one day. Probably not until I retire. I've figured, I would probably just go and get a trailer and I'd just go stay at one of the trailer parks there. Because I'm sure that would be a lot cheaper than actually getting a place out there in Austin. But yeah, Austin has become extremely expensive. So that also becomes another issue here. But let's take a look at the formal qualifications. So in order to serve in the Texas Senate, you need to be at least 26 years of age or older, qualified voter for 5 years, and resident of the senatorial district in which they are elected for 1 year. So basically what this means is that there's this age requirement. You also have to have registered in Texas for at least 5 years, and you actually have to live in the district. What some people might not know is that technically for Congress, you do not actually have to live in the district that you represent. It's not wise politically to do that because your opponent will probably rip you to shreds, if they find out about that. But technically the Constitution, but the Constitution does not say that you have to, at least for Congress. In Texas, it does though. So if you're going to serve in the Senate or the House, you do have to reside in the district that you are representing. So you can't live in another district and represent this one. In the House, 21 years old, qualified voters within the state, legal resident of the state for minimum 2 years, and residents of the district in which they are elected for 1 year. So we still have the residency requirements when it comes to the district requirements. And of course, there's also these state residency requirements and qualified voter requirements, because there are situations where, because you've probably heard some of these these members of Congress, like Mitt Romney. So he's currently the senator from Utah, but he used to live in Massachusetts. He was the former governor there. So how's that possible? I mean, I guess they can move, and they have the money to move. I know Hillary Clinton, similar thing, where she used to live in Arkansas with her husband Bill when he was governor, and then they moved to New York, and so then she became senator over there when they moved to New York after he became president. So yeah, so there, you do see this a lot where some of these politicians, they do move across the country. So they don't have to. The residency requirement for Texas is not that much, and those states also have residency requirements, but they're probably not stringent as well. Just like with Texas, right? I mean, a year that's nothing in terms of how long it takes to actually be eligible here. So okay, let's also take a look at the personal characteristics. So in general, Texas legislators tend to be middle-aged, white, male, Protestant lawyers or businessmen who are married, have college educations, belong to a number of civic organizations, have considerable personal money, as well as access to campaign funds and have the support of the local media. So again, this is a typical profile of who tends to serve in the legislature, right? So these are well-connected people that tend to be wealthy. They tend to be very involved in their community. They tend to be religious. They tend to have these, married with these traditional family values, having gone to, college, and in a lot of cases, pretty prestigious universities. Whether in Texas or maybe outside of Texas. That's why you tend to have a lot of people from like UT Austin, Texas A&M. A lot of them, like former Governor Rick Perry was an Aggie. He went to Texas A&M. Governor Greg Abbott went to UT Austin. So you see how a lot of these major players within Texas government, they tend to be the elite of the elite when it comes to Texas society, right? So now, of course, the issue with this though is that this is not necessarily reflective of who lives in Texas, right? Let's take a look at the characteristics, right? So when we look at within the House and the Senate, let's take a look at the breakdown, right? So we've got the political breakdown in terms of Republicans and Democrats. The ethnicity, look at that. So when you look at ethnicity, right? It's only a little more than a third in the House and a little more than a fourth in the Senate are people of minorities, right? So these are non-white people. Women also tends to be, minuscule, right? In the Senate, it's basically one third. In the House, it's one fourth. The median age in the Senate is 60. Median age in the House is 50 to 59. It's not even middle age. Like the middle age is around 40ish. I'm about to get into middle age already. So now we're getting more into kind of like senior citizen status, right? And then professions, right? At least 12 different ones led by law, fields, business, like I mentioned earlier before, right? Lawyers and business owners, they tend to dominate here within the Texas legislature because of their profession, because of the flexibility of their professions, right? Again, it's going to be hard to be able to serve in the legislature if you've got an hourly job that you have to go to every day. And then, of course, we also have the turnover, not too much. I guess and there's reasons for the turnover that we'll get here in a little bit here. Again, so now here it does go up a little bit more. I guess I guess you could say the book says it's rapid turnover in terms of here, and I guess the point that the book is trying to make here is that I guess it compares rapid turnover, maybe when you compare it to like Congress or things like that, right? And of course this makes a lot of sense because the reasons for the turnover, right? And I also know that seniority not nearly as important as at the national level, although we'll see in some capacity seniority does make a difference, especially like with the some of these ceremonial positions like the pro tempore and all that stuff. But let's take a look at the reasons for turnover. So running for higher office, this usually tends to be the top reason, where members of the state legislature will probably want to move up for Congress. I know a couple of people that I got to meet 2 years ago. There was an event at the Capitol a couple years ago. That was when I was in Waco, so I had time to go down to Austin. If I was in the Valley, I probably wouldn't have had time. But I was staying in Waco a couple years ago, and there was a couple of state reps, Greg Casar, Jasmine Crockett. They were there, and they've all moved on. They've both moved on to Congress now. So you do see that where some of these members of the Texas legislature will look at. No, Casar, he was a Austin city council member. No, but Jasmine Crockett, she was in the legislature. She moved on to. So I apologize for that. So, but she moved on to the Texas. She moved on to Congress. Because they look at that as a step up, right? Like as a promotion type of thing. Retirements can also happen because obviously, of course, you look at the age of these representatives. Although some of them still serve, even into their 70s, right? Especially if they are retired from their regular job, they might want to do this now that they have more time. I know this is something I've thought of as well. Once I have more time, once I retire, this probably might be something I might want to try to get into here. Moving into the more profitable private sector, we do see this like with the lobbyists. So we'll look at that in the interest group chapter. We'll take a look more at how a lot of these lobbyists tend to be former members of the state legislature because they can make a lot more money in the private sector and they can still maintain a lot of this influence. And of course, we'll talk about how this creates a situation where we have the revolving door where you've got these state reps and these former state agency officials now working in the private sector and they all know each other. And that kind of creates a situation where there could be conflict of interest here. Reapportionment redistricting also causes turnover where I know this happened to me, not as a member of the legislature, but when I was a precinct chair, I lost my precinct chairship position because they redrew the lines and I got drawn out of my district, right? But we'll talk about that a little bit later. So turf urban re-election races, you also have ambition from other people within the same political parties that might try to, might try to run for those positions as well. So we do see that sometimes, changing party alignments. Like I said, we saw this like in the 1970s where, the former Democrats started to shift over to Republicans. And we've also seen even some infighting between Republicans themselves. We'll get into that a bit. And then, of course, also voter perception here. Are the voters happy with the job that you're doing? And if they're not happy, then, you can try your best to try to get reelected. But if the voters are not on your side, then it's going to be very difficult to, be able to be welcomed back into the legislature if you don't have the support of the people here. Okay, let's get to the presiding officers here. Let me see how much time. I think we can get it to. Yeah, we might stop here with. Let's see. Bill becomes a law. Okay, so yeah, let's go through this, and then I think we can. Let's try to go through this here. Okay, so let's take a look at the presiding officers here. So the presiding officers are basically these are the top ranking officials within the state legislature here, and they have a ton of power here. So presiding officers and committee chairs dominate the legislative seat. So the chairs of the committees, especially the chairs of the major committees, the ones dealing with the budget and the financing, they are going to be they're going to be very important within the legislature and the legislative process because of their positions of authority here, right? So the presiding officers, lieutenant governor. So this is interesting because the lieutenant governor, while technically is a member of the executive branch, you could make an argument that they're more so a part of the legislative branch because the lieutenant governor is basically in charge of the Senate. So voters elect the lieutenant governor to a 4-year term and a major political force because, as I mentioned, their main role within Texas government is basically to be in charge and control of the Senate, basically to lead the Senate. They're basically in the Congress's version of the Senate, we have the Senate Majority Leader, which basically does this. But in Texas, we have the lieutenant governor, which is a member of the executive. Now, you can make an argument that this is another example of federalism where federalism within the, try to allow for sharing of power even between two branches, where the two branches can, we've got one member of one branch going and serving at the head of another one. So you can make an argument that this is also another way to kind of, balance and share power within federalism, so to speak. But yes, they are a major political force because they set the tone for the Senate. I'm going to explain to you all, what are these examples here, right? So in terms of the procedural and the institutional powers, right? Basically, they set the tone for the Senate. They decide, what gets debated, on who serves on these major committees in terms of the chair people. So they've got a lot of political force here within the Senate, and then the Speaker is basically the House counterpart, right? Now, unlike the lieutenant governor, who was elected by the people, the Speaker of the House is elected by the members of the House, right? So, and this also happens, like I'm sure you all heard what was going on with McCarthy last week, right? He lost his speakership because he got voted out. Which when he got that deal to become Speaker earlier this year, one of the things that he allowed was, as part of the terms of the agreement, was where he could basically be recalled. So ultimately, it happened, and so now, of course, we're looking to see who's going to replace him as Speaker. But yes, it's the members of the House that ultimately elect the Speaker here, and must show respect for members to preserve position, as I just mentioned here with Kevin McCarthy, right? They're in Congress, right? Obviously, of course, if you're going to be in that position of authority, you have to have the blessing of the of the members of the chamber, right? Now, do keep in mind that of course, the speakership is determined based on, yes, on the voting, but it is, of course, a vote that happens along party lines, right? Where the political party that has the majority in the House is ultimately going to decide who the speaker is going to be. What I mean by this is because Republicans are in a majority of the Texas House, just like in Congress, the speaker is always going to be a Republican. It's not going to be a Democrat. Because why would you purposely give power to the other side, right? Especially in these very polarized political times. So the House Speaker will always be a member of the majority party there, right? And again, like I said, they do have to have that respect because it kind of is like a popularity contest, right? You have to try to get the support of the members of the House, the different coalitions, right? The different groups within the House, right? And we'll talk about how that in more recent years, Texas has had some of these disagreements, right? When it comes to the different types of Republicans, right? We saw this play out with the Ken Paxton impeachment situation, which we'll talk about more so when we get to the judicial chapter. We'll talk about how that Dade Phelan, the current House Speaker, I think his picture's here, right? Yeah, so Dade Phelan here, the current House Speaker, him and Dan Patrick, the current Lieutenant Governor, have been having some war words in the aftermath of the Ken Paxton impeachment, which, of course, he was the Attorney General. He was found to, he was acquitted by the Texas Senate, so he was able to, get his job back. And so Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, and all this is online. You can look it up on the Texas Tribune, and I'll add this to the additional resources where you can read some of the comments that Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick. Basically, we'll sum up that he was not happy with, with the process itself. And then Dade Phelan, of course, he was firing back, making the argument that, that it wasn't a waste of time, so to speak, that this was something that needed to be done. And so they're not seeing eye to eye, not just on that issue, but on some of these other issues as well here. So do keep in mind that this is something when we get to the rule of two, or the tyranny of two, like we said, the rule of two, that's Star Wars, sorry, but the tyranny of two, we'll talk about how this is, right? I just gave you all an example of that, but we'll get to that right here in a bit. So, okay, so anyway, both members exercise procedural institutional powers. So like I mentioned, they basically are in charge of their respective chambers, and they basically set the tone for the respective chambers within reason, of course, but they do have a lot of these powers. Let's talk about. So the procedural powers. So they appoint half of the committee members themselves, right? So half the committee members, especially like on these major committees, they are going to be the ones who are going to decide, they're going to decide, half of those members, right? So that's a very important power, right? That one person can decide what half of the committee makeup is going to be. So these presiding officers can, put committee members that are favorable to them, that they find favorable. And the book does talk about this a bit, right? That especially like with the Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick, he definitely is, pretty hands-on. He wants for his committee members to be in lockstep with his vision for what he wants for the Texas Senate to work on and things like that. So Dan Patrick is definitely a very hands-on lieutenant governor, where he basically wants for these committee members to share in his vision type of thing, which is not any different than what you might see like in other places of employment, where you put people in those positions of authority, like let's say you're the CEO and you hire your managers and all that because you want them to carry out the vision that you have for the company. Right? So no, not really any different than what you might see in any organization. It's just that Dan Patrick has been pretty vocal about that, right? Maybe other people not so much vocal, but he has been vocal in terms of that type of philosophy that he has. Appoints the chairs and vice chairs of all the committees, right? So this is also important, right? Because the presiding officers decide who is going to be at the head of the committee. So we'll talk about the committees next time when we go over the lawmaking process, but the committees are extremely important. We'll talk about the committees right here in a bit, because yeah, the next one, I think this will be the last thing we'll talk about here. We'll talk about the committees. The committees, of course, are important, especially the standing committees, because they are the ones who actually handle legislation. So we'll talk about what the committees do in terms of their importance within a legislature. Determines the jurisdiction of the committees through the referral of bills, right? So this determines, the presiding officers determine where these bills go. So when a bill gets introduced, the next step it has to go to the appropriate committee. Well, what is the appropriate committee? That is left up to the presiding officers to ultimately decide which committees will get certain bills. Right now with some of these committees, it's pretty straightforward. When you look at, like the budget committees, the Ways and Means Committee, obviously, of course, they're going to be dealing with the state budget and the money and all that. But some of these bills might not necessarily be like all that. It might not necessarily be all that clear. I'll show that to you all next time when I show you all the listing of the different committees, so that y'all can see for yourselves here. But yeah, so the presiding officers, they have a lot of discretion in terms of where these bills go. They interpret procedural rules when conflict arises. So this is more discretion, right? They basically act as like the referee of the chambers, where if there's a disagreement about rules and procedures, they may have, the final call on determining whether something is, allowed within the rules of the House and the Senate. Because also keep in mind that they have the right to set up their own rules for how business is going to be conducted. Schedules legislation for full action. This is another important power that both of them have, right? They set the calendar. They decide, when a vote is going to happen, right? If a bill gets out of committee, then it has to go to the floor to be voted upon. Well, then of course it requires that extra step where the presiding officers will decide whether it gets a vote or not. So obviously, of course, we're going to see how there's a lot of pit stops and roadblocks that can get in the way of a bill becoming a law here. And the presiding officers definitely have a lot of power when it comes to ultimately deciding, when that happens, if that happens. Also keep in mind, like I said, that because Dan Patrick is independently elected by the voters, he's got a lot more of that I don't necessarily want to say he's got more power than the speaker, but he doesn't have to quite answer to the members of the chamber as much, right? Because the chamber did not select him, right? Whereas with Dade Phelan, the speaker, he has to keep the chamber in mind when he makes his decisions, because he can, he doesn't want to end up like what happened with McCarthy last week, right? Recognizes or prevents members from speaking. There's also another important power that presiding officers decide who will speak, how long they'll speak, and whether they will be recognized to speak or not. They might not be recognized to speak. So that's why you don't want to piss off these people, right? You don't want to piss off the lieutenant governor and or the speaker, right? Because then they might just not allow you to speak. They might just not recognize you. And it's a little more complicated than that, of course, because there's also other procedures in place that when the legislature convenes, they have to come up with the rules that they're going to abide by. So it's not quite as like, well, he don't like me, so he's not going to let me speak. But you definitely don't want to do that, right? You definitely don't want to get on their bad side, right? So that's why there tends to be a lot of cooperation, and there does tend to be a lot of negotiation and things like that. To try to to appeal to them as being professional, things like that. So just like you would in any other organization. So institutional powers, of course, appointing the members of the Legislative Budget Board. So we're going to go over all these three as well in terms of their responsibilities. So we're going to take a look at the Legislative Budget Board, the Texas Legislative Council, and the Legislative Audit Committee, and serving as its co-chair. So basically they decide who's going to serve on these boards. But again, we'll talk more about that a little bit later. Okay, so let's see, because I know we're almost running out of time here. So maybe we could go over the committees next time. Yeah, this might be where we stop here. So the tyranny of two, of course, is unlikely. The book talks about how this idea of tyranny of two is basically, the book is making the argument that, because the speaker and the lieutenant governor have so much power, as I mentioned right here earlier, that they can decide, what gets put on the floor, what doesn't, the scheduling of floor votes, who serves on the committees. And the committees, of course, is the system through which, the lawmaking process occurs. Some people might make an argument that, well, that's, is it just two people basically running the legislature? While they do have a lot of this power, they kind of check each other a little bit. And again, we saw this kind of play out here with those comments that I mentioned about, the Ken Paxton impeachment, right? This creates competition, right? Political ambition and personality, right? So because Dade Phelan and Dan Patrick are kind of like on the same level, they need to negotiate, right? They need to be able to try to coexist, because if you've got both of them at each other's throats, then it's going to be difficult to get anything done, because the Senate can't pass legislation on its own without the House, and vice versa, right? So they need to try to be able to be amicable and try to work together. But it's as we saw here recently, it's definitely easier said than done, right? And of course, both of these men also have political ambition, right? I'm sure Dan Patrick wants to keep moving up within Texas politics, right? He wants to be one of the most powerful. I mean, he already is one of the most powerful, officials within the state of Texas as well. But he seems like the type of person that wants to move up, right, and things like that. If you're going to seek these leadership opportunities, you probably want to keep moving up within these leadership opportunities, right? So, but again, they're not the only players in the game. The governor, of course, also has a big influence when it comes to state policy, as well as the state agencies with their budget requests. The courts also can have a big influence, not just the state, but also the federal courts. We talked about that a little bit with the gerrymandering issue. So there's other people that are involved within the power within the legislature, right? It's not just independent of these other just of these two, right? There are other players involved. Interest groups also have a big stake in this, right? We'll talk more about this. How, like I said, these interest groups basically, because of the money and the resources that they have a lot of influence in the legislative process. You could even make an argument that some of these bills that get introduced are actually written by the interest groups themselves, right? And then they send them to the legislators, and then they introduce them almost word for word. There's been articles written about how especially when it comes to like some of these anti-abortion laws, that they did some investigative journalism, and they found out that a lot of these bills that have been introduced in state houses across the country have very similar, if not identical, wording. So it does happen. And the legislation, of course, does not take place in a vacuum, right? Obviously, of course, like I mentioned with the special interest and their influence when it comes to influencing legislators, when it comes to information, resources, and ultimately, like I said, even in some cases, just, giving them the bills to start with to begin with, but also public opinion, right? How does the public view the legislature and the job that they're doing? And ultimately, that can result in political activism that might culminate in voting, and that could be a situation where the legislature might not. They definitely are going to have to adhere to what the public is wanting. If the public, of course, is organized enough. We talked about, of course, and we'll talk more about this in the voting chapter, how that because Texas tends to be a rather non-voting state or a low voting state, depending on how you word it, that this creates a situation with the legislature. Do they really have to pay attention to the needs and concerns of the people and what the people are wanting if they're not voting? I mean, that does become an issue, right? So, okay, let's go down here for today. We'll pick up on committees next time here. So let me go ahead and stop the share here. Let me also stop the recording.